Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Conserving Catholicism. My name is Nick, and today I'm joined by two amazing guests. Once again, Father Cajetan Cuddy joining us, as well as Dr. Matthew Minard. So Father Cuddy, you've been here before, so if you'd like to give a brief introduction, and then we'll pass it over to Dr. Minard.
Yes, I'm Father Cajetan Cuddy. I teach dogmatic and moral theology at the Dominican House of Studies, and my main research interests are understandably Thomistic philosophy and theology. And as always, I'm very happy to talk to you, Nick, and to dialogue with you in this forum.
Thank you, Father. And then Dr. Minard.
I'm Dr. Matthew Minard. I'm a translator and writer, and I also teach at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary in Pittsburgh, the Ruthenian Catholic Seminary here in the United States. My research interests seem to coalesce in the end around some various topics of actually Thomistic epistemology, noetics, and method, although I kind of do a grab bag of other things, and a lot of translating. So that's what most people seem to know me for.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of great work in the translating. I've been very fond of all the translations that you've done of Father garrigou-lagrange, Father Gardier, and so it's been a real pleasure having those texts in English for someone who's not yet very good at reading French texts and whatnot. So thank you. Great. And so today we're going to be talking about kind of an elusive topic, something that everyone seems to hear the word. It gets thrown out a lot, but it doesn't seem to be very clearly defined for some people, and that's the topic of scholasticism. So we've convened to discuss what scholasticism is, maybe to get to know a little bit more about the history of scholasticism. When did it come about? Where did it come about? As well as look over some of the kind of revived versions of scholasticism that we might see playing out today. So with that, I'll open the floor, I guess, since Father Cuddy has been here before. I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Minard to get the first stab at the question, or one of those questions, wherever you think is the best place to start systematically with this discussion.
Yeah, let me start maybe with a historical note, and then I'll leave Father Cuddy kind of finish that, and then maybe adjust then the conversation. I mean, when we use the term scholasticism as a historical marker of thought, especially within Western Christendom, although it's something that really could be attributed to any time that Christian thinkers, or even thinkers in general, seek in a scholarly and methodological way to explain, causally truth. And so it could really apply to anything. Historically, it's grounded in this moment that took place in Latin Christianity, whenever there was a shifting of culture, we could think, from monastic Benedictine culture of the first millennium of Christianity toward a gradually urbanized form of not only economy, but also intellectual life. Education in the, what could technically be termed the Dark Ages, the very early Middle Ages, the collapse of the empire in the West, at least. Education in the West was something of a kind of hunkering down, maintenance of basic monastic good order and clerkship and whatever legal necessities were needed for that time of Latin Christendom. But gradually over the 9th, 10th, and then especially the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a gradual development both within monastic schools as well as then within cathedral schools to expand and somewhat systematize the classical curriculum of the trivium and the quadrivium, the logical cursus of studies and the mathematical cursus of studies. And especially in the 12th century, under the influence of new texts from the Aristotelian tradition, development just in dialectic that we see, for example, in someone like Peter Abelard and others, in sort of his temporal circle of time. The development of these methodologies sort of shifted what we could think of as the intellectual culture from one that is, it's a little bit stylized to say this, I'm taking this from Jean Leclerc, but from a sort of quasi-humanist appreciation of texts and of the scriptural word for the sake of monastic life, toward a more dialectical and scientific focus. And then this would develop in some of its classical forms in the 13th century, especially in the West, in a highly developed university culture with a very specific sort of method for both teasing out truths within a tradition, as well as then, to the degree this is possible for us as finite knowers, lay out in a scientific manner, philosophical, the moral, the theological patrimony of Christian thought and classical thought. So I think that Father Cuddy will take it right there then to really help us disambiguate then some of the ideas of what scholasticism is, coming from that high, quote unquote, high period of scholasticism, or that classical period of scholasticism in the 13th century in the West.
Oh, thank you. Yes, the first thing when I think of with scholasticism, when it comes to as it's invoked today, it's invoked as a style of academic engagement, as Dr. Meinert has outlined at its roots. And I think its final cause, its purpose, is essential for understanding its content, its form, its method. And as Dr. Meinert has gestured towards already, its purpose was to understand profoundly, deeply, as comprehensively as finite, rational creatures can, what the truth about reality is, and the truth about the ultimate principle of reality, God Himself. And so, if we think about scholasticism, we can identify perhaps for lack of a better word, the literary form. And I say literary form because we have literae, writings that we have from people like St. Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Albert the Great, Duns Scotus, Alexander of Hales, where you have a very clear, almost seemingly scripted method of proceeding. Here's a question. The question is important. Here's one set of arguments for one answer to the question. The master comes in and presents an alternative conclusion, responds to objections. And that's, of course, at the heart of a lot of what we think of when we think of scholasticism. But much more than a style of writing or discussion, academic discourse, the heart, the core of scholasticism, its most essential element, its principle, is the fact that the scholastics appreciated how the human mind can know true things, how the human mind can be conformed to the structures of reality. And they realized with a certain self-awareness that there are, in the panoply of material objects knowable by the human intellect out there in the world, that there's great complexity there. And the human cognitional process, Dr. Meinert is a great expert on all these things, human cognition also has many parts, principles, and elements. And so scholasticism represents, okay, if reality is both simple but also quite complex, and if human cognition has to be conformed to reality in its complexity, with its own, human intellection's own complexity, let's figure out a systematic, methodological, cohesive way by which philosophers and theologians can know the way things are. And let's standardize a method of discourse and proceeding, discussion, disputation, by which not just individual intellectuals, philosophers, and theologians, but the academy, the corpus, the group, the body can do this collectively. And so that, I think, so basically my point is, complementing what Dr. Meinert has said, is to identify scholasticism as much more than a scripted, restrictive, it's like a play. You say this and I say that, and here's the objection, here's the response. But the essence of scholasticism is really something that transcends the high medieval period, because the method of scholasticism reflects both known things, reality, and human cognition. And I'm sure Dr. Meinert can supplement and complement things. You would agree with all of that, I'm morally certain.
And you could be almost scientifically certain, given our overlap. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, can I sort of fill in there just a little bit, and then because this is your show, Nick, so I'll leave you then ask questions, so it doesn't become the Meyer and Cuddy Road show. Yeah, because in a sense, what's in the back of my mind is, I mean, effectively, the whatever we may say for the rest of the Aristotelian corpus, which is very important actually for part of the story and the presuppositions for what I'm going to say about logic. Basically, the institutionalization of a certain kind of dialectics um, that's derived from both Boethius and Aristotle, his topical discourse, and then especially as we come to the time of Thomas Aquinas, the incorporation of the posterior analytics, the logical work on scientific method, becomes, is essentially important for creating a certain kind of discursive culture that is shared among the various learners who engage in the enterprise of, seeking the truth. But not just seeking the truth in some general way, but according to a particular view of methodology that has a really long history and has a philosophical foundation that I would argue is actually unshakable. The Aristotelian organon. There's a kind of continuity in this story because you have, of course, elements of this corpus that exist all the way back into the earlier Middle Ages. But then it's the arrival of the full organon of Aristotle that sort of solidifies what is at least a kind of taken for granted frameworking structure for both how to understand authorities that are presupposed, right? We've got this thing that we're doing, whether it's authorities from the past or even the authorities of our generation, as we consider the various opinions of different authors. We think about if you've ever looked at like Capreolus's commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, I mean, everybody's doing this, but it's very clear there that he's sort of immediately opposing Thomas to these figures who are authorities in the sense that they are interlocutors who are worthy of discourse. Well, there are rules for doing that. There's a logical structure for at least teasing the problem out and then integrating that. However, it's not just endless dialectics, then integrating that into a fully scientific outlook, at least for some thinkers. And I mean, this was very important for Thomas. If one considers the structure of the Summa Theologiae. So that's sort of a broad, I think that Father Cajetan, Father Cuddy and I agree that if we want to look at the heart of what scholasticism is, it is this true methodological, logical culture and habit of mind, which is, however, then defendable philosophically, based on a certain view of what being is and what human cognition is, etc.
Yeah, that's great. And so, we see scholasticism then primarily as this kind of methodological way for both engaging with the truths revelation, but then applying kind of this dialectic and then philosophical reasoning to the truths that we know through revelation. The one question then as well is, since we commonly, and obviously being in Christian circles, equate scholasticism with this kind of medieval Christian era. Can we speak intelligibly about a kind of Islamic or a Jewish scholasticism, or is this something that primarily, because of the truths of revelation upon which it hinges, we say that this is particularly a Christian kind of endeavor?
I'll leave Father Cuddy.
No, I was going to leave you, Dr. Meyer. I saw your eyes light up. You have things to say.
I'm trying to keep myself.
I mean, the short answer is yes, we can speak about Jewish and Islamic scholasticism, and Dr. Meyer will explain how.
Oh, well, if I looked a little bit peaked, it was just, or my eyes were opening, so I was trying to wake myself up a little bit underslept. Yeah, or we could say the same thing too about even Greek Christian scholasticism. I mean, that's a different culture than really what we've been talking about here. I mean, there is a very broad sense in which one can say that a scholasticism is born. Let's just leave this within, first of all, religious traditions, as you're talking about. As soon as you begin asking questions that lead you down the path of trying to make the attribution of properties, proper effects, essences, or natures to certain subjects, to try to actually just to ask the question of why is it that this is, to ask the questions that basically the Aristotelian is going to see this as leading to the particular material logic, which is the posture analytics. I know that sounds like a kind of Whig history, but it's a way of saying when we look to analyze, to define and then logically analyze and the analysis, what it is that we know by faith, and then also then by more broadly by reason, in a systematic fashion. Yeah, you're on your way toward a kind of teachable discipline, and hence for that reason, one can think of it as a kind of scholasticism. It develops itself as a school form. Wow, this is again all kinds of things that are coming up on my Zoom. A school form, whether that school form is something that's just kind of master to pupil, as maybe you'd find in the Greek context, or is in the huge architectonic school form that develops then in the West for the particular cultural reasons of Latin Christianity in the 12th and 13th century. So one can speak of a kind of scholasticism there, just as one could say that there was a kind of scholasticism that burned itself out kind of quickly among the Peripatetics, the followers of Aristotle, right after him. I mean, but however, then the experience of Hellenistic Empire, sort of led then to the post-Aristotelian period of Hellenistic philosophy, which was much more of a grab bag.
And what Dr. Miners is adverting to and indicating is to connect what he said now to our earlier points, both of us, and this is the fact that scholasticism is not exclusively, essentially, or exhaustively an artificial construct. That's how it's caricatured. Namely, this was how the medieval people, with their strange clothing and their strange mores, made everyone operate. There is an element, of course, in which scholasticism, because it comes from the rigors of logic, both formal and material, is an art. Art is both a science and an art. There's an artistic. So there is a presentation and a modality, a formality that they all followed. But the essential underlying continuity between the Peripatetics, the medievals, and then the neo-scholastics that you adverted to, Nick, is the fact that this is how the human mind operates. Reality, fundamentally, being and non-being, the real distinction between being and non-being is not historically contingent. Being and non-being was true in 800 BC. It's true in the year 2024, and it was also true in the year 1216, 1215, 1344, and every other moment. So we have reality has certain essential principles and truths. Human nature also doesn't change. It cannot essentially, and therefore logic, the mind and reality coming together. How does the mind know reality? The nature of the human knower as a rational cognitive creature, a being that knows, and reality as comprising principles, being is non-being are really distinct, form and matter are really distinct, essence, existence really distinct, potency and act really distinct. Those are examples of St. Thomas and Aristotle's engagement with perennial reality. So that's why, if I can get a little using the catchphrases that are often used, but trying to add precision, that's why it's called the perennial philosophy. It's not because this is the perennial style that we follow. It's like, no, being is perennial. And human nature that knows being is perennial. Therefore, the philosophy or theology that comes from that is perennial and transcends a historical epoch, because human persons have always wanted, by nature, to know the way things are. And we see this in culture. This is why when you have high scholasticism, whatever, quote unquote, however we want to define that and delineate that historical period, when you see the architecture of high scholasticism and the proportions of the cathedrals and the basilicas, the order that you see architecturally bespeaks and reflects this fundamental conviction of human persons, regardless of religion, background, that there is order in reality, because reality is knowable. It's impossible. Disorder and chaos is objectively unintelligible. So everyone agreed that being is knowable, reality is knowable, and therefore we live in a knowable reality, an ordered reality, and they express that culturally through all of the formalities which we see architecturally, politically, king, subject, serf, all these things. So that's kind of I'm always emphasizing this: scholasticism is not an purely artificial imposition by the Catholic and Christian Church on poor, supple minds that didn't know any better. And I might even add, this is where there's a very interesting phenomenon known as Reformed scholasticism amongst the Protestants as well. So you had people like Francis Turretin and others who were convicted deeply against Catholic teaching, and yet they recognized as Protestants, Calvinists, that the scholastic method was an effective method to attempt to understand reality. So it's not a denominational thing. We wouldn't say, the church doesn't publish, the Catholic Church does not publish, her scholastic annual with a TM trademark. The church has trademarked this. No, this is something that's trademarked by human nature and by reality. And therefore, because God made both, it's trademarked by God.
Yeah, that's great. So we have then within the scholastic enterprise, within it, kind of like an ecumenical discourse that we're able to engage in. Insofar as you said, we're looking at we're recognizing the truths of reality as well, and it's very, just, in a sense, common sense methodology. I might phrase it that way. So what is the reason for the fall of scholasticism in some sense? It obviously goes through a period where it goes out of vogue before we kind of reach this this revival period, which we'll get to. But if it's one of those things where so many people can partake in it and really engage in this method, what's the cause of it, or people turning away from it?
Maybe I'll start there. Yeah, so they're right, it's multidimensional, right? There's one of these multi-factor things. So whatever we say, there will be other things that could be said. And so the person who's listening to this and happens to be informed of those other things shouldn't get overly frustrated, and have mercy on those who are doing live events. So of course there are certain things, and it's a story that most people like to tell about sort of the internal trouble of scholasticism. Sort of standard narrative is 14th to 15th century becomes much more nominalist. People are worried about all sorts of little questions of logical detail, and that's it. Right, angels on the head sort of thing. But just as important, and really probably more important from the perspective of the overall intellectual culture of the West. And I'm just saying that because this is the Eastern Catholic in me, that although I'm a Thomist, I'm kind of aware that there are other spaces even within the Catholic world, let alone then kind of broader Christian world that's not Western. I'm not using this though as a kind of polemical expression. But the economic and scientific changes, and hence also technological changes that took place in the 15th, 16th, and then continued in the 17th century, marked in many ways, I'm not trying to be super Heideggerian here, talking about technology, but marked in many ways a very different outlook about what knowledge is. I think it's George Grant. I don't know who I'm taking this from actually, but the idea of technology as this sort of fusion of at once science and what used to be techne or art in the classical sense, is this just driving intellectual force that's so obvious, whether you're reading things from the Anglophonic world or the continental world, right? The idea of being masters and possessors of nature. We think of Descartes. Why does he want to rouse up some money when he writes the Discourse on Method? It's so that he can, just get his philosophy good enough so that he can have benefits in effectively engineering and medical science. Is effectively how he pitches it. And so an attention on what is a legitimate enterprise, the conquest of nature by way of artistic fabrication, but a highly technical one, but one whose teleology, whose internal kind of drive is always toward this kind of mastery of nature, becomes the cultural form that is dominant for the kind of classical modern period. Alongside this, and it's kind of this thing that's always kind of floating around, I think, just because of the nature of the human mind, right? If you think about the scholastic method itself, I've already talked about the role of authorities. You cannot have a method of human knowledge that passes on from generation to generation without having authorities in a discourse space that basically picks the ball up from the last generation and continues the kind of conquest or the kind of struggle with being, And of course, some sources, some authorities are authorities precisely because they're worthwhile, right? Even if we don't quite understand them yet, they have a certain credibility because they get it right on most things. We're going to take them as our points of departure. But humans also like to scratch around and find every source under the sun. In the words of Father Leonard Lehou, we sometimes like to scratch around in every bit of 12th century scholasticism to think that that's going to give us the key for understanding Thomas. So what I'm taking a stab at here, and someone who's probably a bit sensitive to my polemics in this regard will get angry, but I'm trying to be playful. The humanism, the disposition toward a kind of humanism or text source focused kind of intellectual culture is also something that is existent on and off in different ways. Is an immediate response to 14th century scholasticism. That's just as obvious if we think about the role of humanists versus scholastics. The final thing, just to kind of give my framework of a narrative so that Father Cajetan can pick up from here, Father Cuddy. I apologize, but my familiarity is coming, is expressed publicly here. We have nominalism and humanism. We have sort of later scholasticism and then technological rationality. And then also, too, although other things could be added, just the cataclysms of the revolutions, right? The significant cultural, intellectual, and hence also religious cultural upheaval that takes place just shatters apart the kind of institutional structures that you need for the continuity of this kind of culture, which was already under a lot of stress because of modern thought in its kind of modern philosophical apparatus, which again is very much kind of undergirded by this desire for philosophy to serve either the kind of technological enterprise of the human person of this period, or often very politically motivated as well. And so all of those are different headspaces that are not scholastic. Those are not what we were just describing. And so along those lines, I'll let maybe Father Cuddy have some ideas based on that answer. Show myself to be the student of a hymns person. It's like a historical answer, right? But
no, it's fascinating because Dr. Martin and I didn't do any pre-interview discussion about this, but yeah, no, that's exactly how I think about it too. And the unifying element in everything that Dr. Miner just said is the shift from Homo sciens, the man is knower, to Homo, fabricans, the fabricating man, or Homo faber. And so it's the triumph, or it's the exaltation of art, practicality, fabrication, industry over contemplation and speculation. And you think about it, just to translate it back into its fundamental categories of principles. So we have the human person as a knower, we have reality as something that is intrinsically intelligible because it has a form, a formality, it is knowable. Scholasticism is fundamentally convinced that the final destination, the goal, the end of scientific study, rigorous contemplation, is that the mind would be conformed to the form, to the essence, to the nature of reality, whether that be natural or supernatural. So we could say this is a little overstated perhaps, but I think it's true. The final goal of the scholastics is passive. They want to be shaped by reality, to know the way things are. With the rise of technology, what you have is the emergence and the elevation of an element of human cognition, and that is when the human mind knows some things, it can use its knowledge of things to change external objects. So the artistic form works in the opposite direction of the scientific formality. So the scientific and the contemplative and formality is to recognize that there's a form out here in reality that my mind can be impressed with, can be conformed to. The artistic form says, okay, I have a formality in my mind. Let me try to impose or impart that on external things. And so we see this as very evident. Dr. Miner invoking Descartes. Descartes views philosophy as fundamentally ordered towards a practical end. Let's do stuff. And then Dr. Miner, wisely and sagely brings this out into the big picture. Let's do stuff on a societal level. That's the political revolution. Revolutionaries, the best book on this, written by the former, he's now deceased, God be good to him, head chief librarian of the Library of Congress, James Billington's book, Fire in the Minds of Men, is a fascinating, impeccably rigorous academic study of the origins of revolution. And what you see is there is always a group of young intellectuals, some of them very young, we're talking 20s, who had ideas about the world and about culture in their mind, and almost like pseudo evangelists go out to try to spread their message. And those ideas, then, this new formality, and of course, you see this in the French Revolution, you see this in the Russian revolutions, this gets imposed. So, to just summarize, the reason why scholasticism fell out on a principial level, we could say, is because common sense is hard. And I might even say scholasticism was searching for the commonist sense, or the sense of the most common things, universal. That's hard. Universals are hard to get clarified in the mind. And eventually you get tired. And then with the rise of technology and industry, et cetera, people began to realize, oh, wait, ideas can do things. And so the practical, the fabricating emphasis emerged. And you see this in a single philosopher like Descartes, and in politically executed philosophies like Marxism, even Hegelianism. All of these things come together. I mean, Dr. Miner, you're nodding your head. I'd assume we're still on the same page with this.
Yeah, no, what you just said actually about Marx, I was thinking, I mean, Marx has that famous line, right, about the thinkers of up to, or whatever, the philosophers of up to this time talked about what the world is. Now they'll change the world or whatever. I mean, the language is almost Cartesian. Is almost like it's just you could draw a line. You could draw a line because it's the same kind of Geist, whether it's artistic or more sort of social, political. Really, though, I mean, technically, Marx is in the world of kind of a social political world that's on the edge of that kind of social science of the middle part of the 19th century onward. So you can see sort of the same animating spirit. And it's important to see this because it's a conceptualization of how the mind relates to reality in legitimate ways, because there are different orderings of the mind toward reality, whether it's the sort of purely contemplative modality or speculative, or then this fabricative or political. Because I say political as sort of because politics is in a sense at the natural level, your highest rationality in the moral order, at least kind of thinking in the kind of classical terms of Aristotle. It's also sort of an order to talk about with logic, but we could think of that sort of like intellectual culture, but that doesn't matter for us now. But anyway, yeah, just what you said with Marx there just had me nodding regarding that. I have one random thought. I want to ask if Father Cajetan, because I think Father Cuddy can help here, because there's a background thing in my response that maybe he can help balance. Would you think, setting aside maybe the bigger humanistic question that I had, that sometimes the obsession with sources is a kind of grasping attempt, but sort of like I'm gesturing here. It's sometimes looking for this and that to escape back into a contemplative mode, right? That it's an attempt to get back into sort of like a kind of what we are thinking of as scholastic, but in a sense aborted because it stops by its nature at establishing the source. So it remains dialectical, but it's a kind of, the humanistic impulse is actually closer to the scholastic impulse, but it's like a first step and an important step because you have to establish text, etc. I don't know, just that's a thought I had along the way. So the humanists and scholastics are actually together, in a sense, against these other veins. Because the humanist, just like the classicist or the classical education person, is really going to have trouble the same way convincing a world that's technically and politically motivated that such methods are of use, whether humanistic or more scholastic. We see this, I think, culturally, actually, thinking about it with like educating my kids, for instance.
That's a very interesting insight, Dr. Miner, and I think you're absolutely right. And the first thing that my mind goes to is if we were to delineate, let's say, scholasticism as kind of an expression of realism, moderate realism certainly, but reality is out there, it's knowable. Then you have the Renaissance, the humanistic emphasis on texts and sources, but texts and sources as expressions of other philosophers, theologians, authors' engagement with reality. So in the humanists, you still see they're primarily interested, even though their proximate attention might be a text or a source, their ultimate aim is still to know the way things are. It's an indirect contemplation of reality, or a contemplation of reality conjoined to an appreciation for texts, which are themselves artifacts left behind by other contemplatives who wanted to understand reality. So the text becomes a mediation of a knower to me as a seeking to be a knower. I can think the thoughts of another knower in a previous generation by way of his books. Then you have in the modern period, there's the external reality is kind of cut off in its priority. We're radically skeptical about whether or not we can know that. So you have a radical subjectivism, the triumph of art. I start in my mind and I push out forms. But it's interesting. Then you see this almost middle between the humanists and the ultimate skeptics, with what became known as ressourcement in the late 19th, early 20th century, whereby in an attempt to get out of our radical subjectivism, which is really a cage that enslaves, we now turn to the text, but missing, and this is what Dr. Miner gestures towards, without missing the final step that the humanists had, which is we go to a text to go to reality. So the texts now are a replacement for knowing the way things are. So to make it concrete, the humanists, someone out of the humanists, they might have studied Aristotle very carefully, or Cicero very carefully about a given thing, but ultimately their goal, appreciating rhetoric and art and all the things that are legitimate, they want to know and engage with reality as it is. Today, we study a text because in some ways, academically, texts are the most real things. And so we're watching, it's almost like texts now give us a movie of reality, rather than being for the humanists a window through which you'd actually look at reality. If that metaphor makes sense. I think that, yeah, Dr. Miner, I'm with you. Please, yeah, you're
The only
ready
thing
to supplement here. Go.
And the only thing I would say to save us from too much friendly and unfriendly fire is that you're using the term ressourcement in a very in an attempt to delineate a division, is right that there's no one that's even in mind here, because it's very hard to get yourself into that kind of pure textualism, but it is the ghost of the academy today, because especially whenever you're trying to live according to, it's just like what happened with scriptural studies, when you're trying to live according to the norms of a skeptical culture, the text and what it says can stand in for legitimacy. Look, I'm doing this scientific thing, which is that I'm just establishing a historical point of data. And it risks that kind of textual closeness methodologically, which is something that I know that you've talked about publicly before. But of course, when our fellow Catholics who are not quite as on board with the scholastic methods of us hear this, I think you would agree that many of them engage in a kind of there's a humanism as well that's, I think, at play there. It still has its odds with with our sort of the sort of scholastic culture that we work within, but kind of pure textualism is a limit point, which is a real risk, though. It's not a risk, because you'll see how it plays out on certain people. I had a professor in graduate school where it was very often the case that whenever you would get to the edge of something that you couldn't textually do, that the conversation would sort of shut down, and those are indicative moments where the text is now the hermeneutic. That's all. I just wanted to just make sure that when people hear this, they realize that I'm not, and I don't think you are, slurring together those two. Right?
No, absolutely not. No. Just yeah. So when I say ressourcement, I mean that more in the formality, trying to abstract. Ressourcement is difficult to define. That's the hard thing too. So I'm gonna. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Miner, very much. I agree with everything you've just said. We're not thinking of individual theologians, but of kind of an elusive but real formality which informs a lot of contemporary discourse in theology and even philosophy. And just the fundamental point, if I had to say it in 30 seconds, it would be this. The scholastics were convinced there was no division between the mind as a knower and reality as known. The rise of modern philosophy brought into grave suspicion whether the mind could actually know reality. Hence the rise of subjectivism, and what a textuality and a source or a humanist emphasis in its modern expression took was, well, if I can't know reality directly because of Kant and Hume and maybe whatever, I can know what this book says and I can apply, as Dr. Mike says, rigorous scientific criteria, hermeneutics, to a text, which in some ways, hermeneutics, the rise of hermeneutical science, parallels the rigor of scholasticism with knowing reality. We have reality, and sources can't know reality directly for a variety of reasons, perhaps, but I can still be rigorous in my knowledge of engagement with texts, authors, and history. And Dr. Miner, that would be a fair thing you would say, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yeah, and that's so what's going to be the difference is if there's not a further move that sees that kind of stabilization of the text as a first step, which is not meant to denigrate it, like right, as though kids play and so the real guys can do stuff. No, no, I mean different intellectual tasks, different people with different skills do, and different talents do. But if you don't see that as on the way toward, I did not mean that thumbs down. This is I don't know why I'm getting things that are coming up all over the place. I need to turn this off on my Zoom. That textual stabilization, if you don't see it as the first step on the way toward an explanatory sort of knowledge, which is what you have to do, right? Like if you really want to worry about the truth claim itself, you're always going to tend in that direction. But if you don't do that, you will then end in this sort of, you can end in this pure textualism, sort of, counting how many different ways certain terminology is used without asking though, but why is that important and what is the structure of the demonstration that is found, or at least the logical form that is expressed in this text? Very hard to imagine kind of pure textualism. I mean, it's going to tend more and more and more toward kind of away from philosophical rules and more toward kind of a I don't know what I'm looking for right now. It'll come to me later. I mean, I have a specific word in mind is the problem. It would do all the lifting for me. But I mean, you would change your primary analytic to something that is completely historical. And that's, I mean, it's hard it's very elusive to get this formality into words is the issue. So the short is technically that kind of source stuff is a dialectical attempt to see reality. And if you admit that fact, you're already one step on the way toward a kind of scholasticism. If you see that you want to structure a true response to the essence of what reality is, you have to go on the mode beyond dialectics to science. So.
And if I may say, Nick, you're the host and we're running the show here. We will give you the wheel in just a second.
Great.
But even the fact that you kindly invited us on to have this discussion is an example of what Dr. Meyer is saying, and that is for a long time, text, sources, history, authorities, those have been significant in philosophy and theology in the humanities. But the fact that we're even rethinking or discussing scholasticism and that you see more and more books and articles indicative of scholastic method, that reveals not that sources are not bad because the human mind wants to know. And all students, no one who's saying is going to say we don't need texts and sources. But what's happened is more corporately, and it's progressing, particularly amongst the next generation of philosophers and theologians, is a dissatisfaction with an implicit reality as the end. We want to make explicit, yeah, I'm studying these things and all these rigorous courses we have to go through in grad school because I want to know a text to know reality. So I think the progression, the goodness of sources and of texts has led the human mind, the human person as a knower, to rediscover scholasticism because we want to get to the object that inspired the texts, namely being.
Yeah, and I mean that's what you see too in the best scholastics, right? There's a healthy balance between looking at the authorities and reconciling the authorities, but then not ending their investigation there. So you obviously have a big emphasis on reconciling seeming contradictions between varying authorities, but even contradictions between a single authority that they might have throughout their corpus. But they're not doing that just so that way they can say, "Oh, look, I've figured out how this one thinker is able to say two seemingly contradictory things." But they're doing that on the step toward, okay, what is the actual fact of the matter later on? And I think it's a temptation, obviously, even today. At least I know in my experience, some people I talk to, let's say about, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, and it's like, well, St. Thomas doesn't say that thing specifically, or ex professo. It's like that's not in the Summa, or wherever you're looking at. It's like, sure, it's not there, but I'm not studying St. Thomas just simply to be able to list a bunch of facts of what St. Thomas says, but so that way I can actually engage with, all right, well, where is this going? What's ultimately this is all aiming at? So that's just a little additional piece, my piece. I don't know, Dr. Miner, if you had that thought that came back to you.
No, I wish I did. It's a specific discipline. I mean, I just kids keep me from sleeping like now for months and months. But you just said though exactly in just such a nice succinctness what we were trying to get at there. This experience that you have is touching on the fact that there is this formality, this outlook that is somehow hermeneutically sealed. I mean, Father's aware, because I had to ask him about some things in Melchior Cano, that in the back of my mind is this stage between, it's especially it's powerful in philosophy in its own way too, though, if you think about Aristotle's method, but it's very powerful in theology. The stage of dialectics with regard to the authorities is just so super important. It's really important for the scholastic culture, but it's like Thomas. It's like he loves the authority so much that he wants to say, I think I've articulated reality this way, and I have such reverence for Augustine or whomever that I'm going to say he saw it that way too. Right? That's sort of how he does it. I mean, I think it's charming. Historically sensitive people get mad at it. I think it's just wonderfully charming.
Yeah, well, I mean, he wants them to also be in conformity to reality as well. So if there's a way in which he
Yeah.
needs to speak it or interpret it in a certain way, he'll do that. But it shows as well that St. Thomas is not simply just exegeting himself, or just or all it is just all right. What did they say? What did he say? But it's all right. What's he's still using them to help on the way toward understanding reality. But it's not, the buck's not stopping there. Yeah, and I guess the next question I have is, we've talked a little bit about kind of the fall, and also if we need to wrap things up soon, please let me let me know. I don't want to keep you here too long. But so we've talked a little bit about the fall of scholasticism as well, and kind of some of these alternate ways of interacting, we can say, with reality. But then we again have at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, a kind of scholastic revival. We hear the phrase a lot, neo-scholasticism, and some might say that neo-scholasticism doesn't have much in common with scholasticism itself. But clearly, I mean, I don't think that's the case. So what is kind of responsible for this neo-scholastic revival, and if you can shed some light, kind of what's the continuity that they're seeking to keep with the scholastic tradition?
So I would say, so I know both Dr. Miner and I are, as soon as you bring up neo-scholasticism, we begin to get, we're very awake, because this is something we spend a lot of time on, and we have a great passion for, both to vindicate, to clarify, and to refine. And so I would say first of all, neo-scholasticism was not a movement that came about because the church said, things are bad now, let's go back to the glory days. Whenever, the medieval cathedrals, medieval culture, medieval thinking, if we just return to the 13th, 14th, 15th century, it'll be much better. That's not what neo-scholasticism was about. What was it about? It was the fact that the church and her theologians and philosophers looked around. Aeterni Patris, the papal encyclical of Leo XIII that called for the restoration of Christian philosophy, says there's a lot of confusing things going on right now. Legitimate questions, concerns, ideas are in vogue. And the church and her theologians and philosophers needs to responsibly and rigorously engage them. And the sharpest tool to engage the very real questions of the modern period is scholasticism. So that's what's neo about scholasticism. It's not saying let's go back and impose an old way upon new ideas, new cultures, and just kind of it's like the return to a previous generation time travel experiment. Rather, it's recognizing here and now in the world are new questions, ideas, and concerns that demand rigorous engagement, and the most rigorous engagement that we can provide comes about through the methodology of scholasticism. So, bottom line, that's in a way a very real compliment from the church and from her theologians and philosophers to the formidable questions and issues that emerged in modernity, because it said, it effectively meant, okay, these are good questions, and it's going to take some real rigorous engagement to kind of parse these things. And the most rigorous engagement we can give is a reapplication of the scholastic method to them. So neo-scholasticism is not a sign of disrespect for the legitimacy and even the vigor and rigor of modernity's questions. It's a compliment because it says we need to parse this with a formidable and responsible way.
Yeah, and in the context of the encyclical, you basically have like in the let's think like 18th and 19th centuries, it's a mess in seminary formation and more broadly. I mean, Catholic thought has imbibed all sorts of things from kind of regnant philosophy. Now, not everywhere the orders are different. This is what makes it less new in the sense that it's not just all whole cloth jumping out of nowhere. But the church looks, and as Father Cuddy has said, the church looks and says, this great tradition of particular authorities who are engaged in the application of this method for the articulation of reality has the principles and major conclusions, as well as many opinions, that are of use to now saddle up and, in a lively and living way, answer the issues of today, right? To answer the issues that face the world politically, epistemologically, and so forth. And you see this confidence during that period. Some people look at it now as kind of naive because it doesn't seem historically sensitive, right? Because in a sense, Thomas Aquinas is not answering these questions. But the church basically says, we believe that the long history of scholasticism, because if you read the encyclical, it doesn't just say, it says go back to Thomas, but it also makes clear that Leo is thinking of the history of the application of this method in the schools, that this living tradition is able to answer questions today that, guess what, weren't actually answered then, but it can do it in a way that is living through the vitality, the cognitional vitality of the very principles and major conclusions and opinions of the thinkers of this age, especially Thomas Aquinas. So
that's great. Well, I want to respect both of your times and not take you here for too long. But just as like just fun kind of lightning round questions that we did last time with Father Cuddy, I think it'd be fun to do here for the both of you as well. Just a couple of them, not too many, but related to the theme. Besides, because both of you obviously are very fond of St. Thomas. So besides St. Thomas, who would you consider your favorite scholastic thinker?
I'll go first. To be honest, I think one of the smartest persons in history, Dr. Meyer knows what I'm going to say, is Blessed Duns Scotus. I disagree with him on many significant things, but every time I engage him, I find him just stunning with his brilliance, perspicacity, and penetration. And so, in terms of scholastics with a capital S, again, even though I disagree on many things, if not most, with Scotus fundamentally, he's near the top, if not the top, of people I admire.
yeah, I'm not trying to then choose the low hanging fruit, but this is where I'm going to actually just say, I'm going to say Francisco Suarez, because I think he had the bravery to at least write. I mean, the others were doing this too, but to write treatises that are in their own right, metaphysical disputations, for instance, that are structured to I'm going to try to deal with the fact that I don't have a full treatment of these topics in list form that's not just kind of in the format of questions that are just tracing Aristotle. I don't know. I have a certain love for for that, a certain honesty. Same thing if you think about, his various treatises. I mean, in the end, I think that the various treatises, on grace or on law, they kind of uneven things in their placement. But I have a certain respect for someone who has looked back methodologically and says, well, I need to actually order these things in a way that it's not apparent that the current order that I'm using works. Now, again, I'm not saying I agree with that ordering, but I don't know. I have a real admiration for that because that's honest and not just kind of just recycling.
Mhm. And then, lastly, in a very brief way, if possible, what do you think is the 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 benefit, or how should I phrase this? The best thing that scholasticism can offer the church and her theologians or philosophers today.
Let Dr. Minor take the lead on this.
With wisdom, the ordering of principles and conclusions.
Amen.
Great. Well, Father Cuddy, Dr. Minard, thank you very much for joining us today to speak about scholasticism. Dr. Minard, I know you're available online a little bit. Is there anywhere people can find you and follow you?
Oh,
To,
go to, MatthewMinor.com is my website, but yeah, it's mostly just a repository for my CV.
great. All right. Well, I'll link it in the bio.
And one thing, if I may, Matthew, Dr. Minor, he and I co-author a weekly kind of online journal of reflection called "To Be a Thomist." We take turns every other week. One of us posts something, and so it's at atomist.com. That's something that he and I do together. If they want to, I try to have as little a digital footprint as possible, but um, in our shared interests, we have that in common as well.
Very good. Well, I'll link both those in the description. Thank you guys again for joining us, and have a good one.
Well,
Thank you very much.